see if we get some more people. So yesterday we spent the majority of the time talking about the lead up to the United States actually becoming its own country, right? And today we're focusing on kind of aftermath of that. Right? So now the United States has won its independence, its own country, right? And kind of where do they go from here, right? Not so much from the politics or the government side of things, because we talked about that in pretty good detail last week and the week before, but just kind of big picture, where does the United States go once they get their independence, and what does the United States start to look like? Because obviously, just geographically, if we're looking at a map of the United States like I've got here, right, the original 13 colonies don't make up a very big portion of what would eventually become the United States, right? Only this little sliver on the East Coast was actually considered, or was actually part of the United States when we first found it. Right? And so this map just kind of shows a timeline, and we're going to kind of go through some of these steps in more detail, but just you can kind of see the dates on some of this and this slow westward movement, right, that happened over years and years and years. So original 13 colonies, we win our independence. 1783 was when the American Revolution was officially ended. We signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Again, we didn't actually, win the war and rid ourselves of English rule until we signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, right? 1783, 13 colonies, and then so we win our independence, and immediately as part of, right, if you see here, the stuff in orange, immediately upon signing the Treaty of Paris, right, we are given a big chunk of land, of territory that was not there were no colonies there yet, right? So we were given this big chunk of land, basically everything from the East Coast all the way up to the Mississippi River. It was this dividing line between where Great Britain owned territory and where France owned territory on the west side of the Mississippi, right? So we win the American Revolution, we sign the treaty, and we're given this big chunk of orange land all the way up to the Mississippi River. So we're talking about present day, Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and there's more states: Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. I'm not necessarily trying to list all the eventual states that were part of that, but the point is, so we get our independence, and right away the United States more than doubles in size. But essentially people are still living along the East Coast in the original colonies, and this territory here is essentially undiscovered wild land. Then if we follow the timeline further, right, in 1803 is when we purchase this huge chunk of land from France, the Louisiana Purchase, and it was this giant chunk of red territory. Okay. Then further on down the line, in 1818, Great Britain come to a compromise with Britain again, succeeding. So we give this little chunk here to Great Britain. They give us this. So basically, we established the 49th parallel as the dividing line between the United States and what would be at the time territory of Great Britain, would eventually become Canada. Right? And that's 1818. 1819, we get Florida from Spain. And we also get this little chunk of Spanish territory here. You can see that's all part of this 1819 Spanish secession. 1845 was the Republic of Texas. So Texas was essentially operating as its own country up until 1845. They became part of the United States then, right? 1848, Mexico gives us this giant chunk of the Southwest, so present-day California, Nevada, parts of Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico. And then 1846, I guess technically that would have happened first, the Oregon Territory, which was British owned at the time, or British controlled, and in 1846 was given to the United States. So, and then lastly down here, we don't want to forget about Alaska and Hawaii. 1867, we purchased Alaska from Russia. 1898, we gained Hawaii as a territory. So that isn't necessarily when all these things became states. That's different and maybe a different topic for later on. But in terms of acquiring the territory that would eventually become the United States, that's kind of the timeline, right? So essentially, if we take Hawaii out of it, which was near the turn of the century, by 1867, the United States looked essentially like what it looks like today, okay? In terms of the geographic space that it. So let's look at that a little bit slower. That's kind of a rush through. All right, so again, same kind of map, all right? I'm gonna move on from that one. All right, so here's the first kind of topic I wanna slow down and discuss a little bit. And I will say before I get into this, again, if you have questions, ask them in the chat. And if you do wanna ask me anything at the end of class over video or audio, please message me so that I know you're interested in that. Otherwise, we'll just end like. So back to this, manifest destiny. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but it was this belief that permeated American culture that the United States felt like they were destined or justified in expanding over the entire American continent. So they felt like it was, their destiny to go fulfill this thing where all of this continent would eventually become the United States, right? So you had a lot of people pushing westward, right? Because of this prevailing belief that they felt like it was like they were entitled to that, or maybe not entitled, but that they were fulfilling a destiny of all Americans by pushing west. So this kind of frontier spirit or adventure spirit of these people saying, we're going to leave the known in the original 13 states, and we're going to go settle land to the west that's totally new and unknown, right? And so it was this kind of sense of both entitlement, destiny, but also kind of this adventurous spirit that we associate with being American. And it kind of dates back to this period of westward expansion where you had so many people leaving these cities and towns in the east and settling in these unknown lands further and further and further west, right? So that's manifest destiny. All right, so again, I said I wanted to talk about some of these particular purchases in more detail, and definitely the biggest one and the one we probably want to spend the most time talking about would be the Louisiana Purchase. So 1803, President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the purchase from France for $15 million. So this entire tract of land, and here you can see it laid over a picture of the current state map. So the Louisiana Purchase was huge. It essentially doubled the size of the United States like that, right? And we're talking about most of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, parts of Texas, Oklahoma, parts of Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming. I got them all, right? That was on my state knowledge. But you can see a lot of land. And again, it wasn't like French people were living there or had colonized. It was essentially land no one had discovered, no European had discovered. France had just claimed this land for themselves and agreed to sell it to Great Britain, or not Great Britain, to America. But again, this kind of goes back to the difference between how Europeans viewed land and how Native Americans viewed land, right? Native Americans didn't have the same concepts of land ownership that people in Europe did, right? And that's just a difference in culture, right? So Native Americans lived there, but they didn't necessarily claim like the physical land as, this is our boundary and you can't. That wasn't how they viewed it. Whereas the Europeans said, if we own this land, then it's ours and it's not yours, right? So that would eventually lead to lots of controversy and lots of, right, essentially battles over land between Native Americans. So the big thing talking about the Louisiana Purchase was after we bought this land, we didn't know anything about it. And so Thomas Jefferson hired Lewis and Clark to go and explore this new territory and hopefully find a path west to the Pacific Ocean. That was kind of the goal, was to find the western edge of wherever the continent ended, right? And that's what they set out to do. And in doing so, they charted the new territory, explored unexplored places, and mapped things out as best they could, right? To kind of give, when they came back, to give a sense of what was out there and show people, to show at least the president and the White House what it was that they bought, or what it was that they got from France. This slide here is just talking about some of the different trails west. So when we say trails, we're talking about wagon trails, essentially. So not necessarily people, not like hiking trails. They were like rough roads. And when I say roads, very, very rough, right? They were like dirt paths that had been kind of worn down by the stream of travelers moving west. So after, and this doesn't happen right away, right? So this map is kind of a snapshot in 1850. That's almost 50 years after Lewis, right? So Lewis and Clark explore it, but it's still a slow move west. It's not like Lewis and Clark explore it and then everyone all of a sudden, right? There's all these different trails, and they started for various reasons, and different types of people set out west for different purposes, right? So a few to mention here would be the Oregon Trail, California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the Old Spanish Trail, right? So we think of the Oregon Trail, right, because it kind of comes through present-day Washington and Oregon, and was essentially the route that Lewis and Clark pioneered to get to the Pacific Ocean, right? I'm not going to point out all of these different trails, but you had a big push west to California in 1849 when gold was discovered. So the kind of first big gold rush happens in 1849, and everybody floods to California to try to strike gold and make it big and be rich, right? Everyone dreams of a gold, or everyone in 1850 was dreaming of finding gold and having enough of it to change your life. So you have this massive influx of people moving west. Gold, the Mormon Trail, you guessed it, is associated with the Mormon religion, right? So you get Mormons who, were being essentially persecuted, or because their views were different and new compared to other religions. And even though we talked yesterday briefly about when the United States was formed, it was formed under this basis of religious freedom. But at the time, the Mormons were kind of seeking shelter from people that were giving them a hard time. And so they had slowly moved west and west and west to try to get away and to practice their own version of religious freedom. So they end up in Salt Lake City, you can see there, right? In Utah today, we know is where a large portion of Mormon religion is Um, and so again, the whole point is, just like with reasons people had for leaving England to come to the 13 colonies, right? People had lots of different reasons to leave the East and move west in the United States. Same thing, right? And so it's just this constant drive, powered partly by manifest destiny, but also just by the adventurous spirit and for seeking freedom, seeking adventure, seeking, you know, whatever it was they were seeking, new opportunities, right? Both land and money. Because just like with Great Britain, the East Coast, or the, you know, the original states, started to get crowded, started to, you know, there were not as many job opportunities, or, you know, so if you were somebody that was looking for a job or didn't have land or a home, you know, it was easy to go west and find all that stuff because it was less out there, right? Now I'm doing on time. And then let's see here. I think, yeah. So let me go back. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about the Civil War, but today we'll kind of finish up running through talking about some of the conflicts with Native Americans, and then I'll see if I can pull up a practice question or two that deals with this kind of westward expansion. So, especially in the Southeast, we get a massive amount of conflict with Native Americans. Okay? So you can see the dates down here. We're talking early 30s, roughly. We have numerous Indian tribes, or Indian, at the time they were tribal territories. They weren't reservations in the sense that we know them today, right? But these were areas where these Native American tribes were living, right? And from all of this conflict, you essentially end up with the relocation of all of these Native Americans. So we have the Trail of Tears, which is what it was called. It was the forceful movement of a lot of these Native Americans in the Southeast, so especially Seminole Indians, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw. And those Native Americans were essentially forced to relocate to Indian reservations, which is what they were called, in present-day Oklahoma, right? And so you can see these routes they took, but basically you can see where they started, and you can see where they ended up, right? So they were just kind of pushed west. And for the same reason, they continued to be pushed west, essentially, because as more and more Europeans came, they moved further and further west, and so you start to see, you know, the frontier line, or the edge of civilization just starts to creep west and creep west, and as you move west, you're moving into Native American territory, right? And so the further west you move, you encounter a new tribe, and there's new conflict, and then they're relocated further west, and then that line just keeps getting pushed west, and Native Americans keep getting pushed and pushed until finally there's nowhere else for them to be pushed, right? And we end up with the system we have today, which is pockets of these little reservations scattered across the entire United States. That's essentially the territory that they have now. Okay. So again, some of this isn't particularly stuff that you need to remember. These are just some examples of some of the particular battles. Along with the Trail of Tears, we also have the Treaty of Greenville, which was Native Americans giving up this big chunk of the Ohio Valley. Same kind of concept here. They agreed to it, but reluctantly, and they were essentially kind of forced into it, either by violence or by negotiation, right? So with that, I know we're still a little bit early, but let's stop the PowerPoint there at least, and we'll pick up tomorrow. I don't want to get into talking about the Civil War because it's just an entirely different topic. So let me see if I can dig up at least a couple of practice questions for us to do before we call it a day for class, and then go from there. So and I know some of these questions deal with, I'm trying to find some questions that don't. Give me just a second. Not, then maybe we will actually discuss a little bit. So let's do these two questions that deal with this timeline. It talks about, hopefully we can see that okay. Make sure I'm going to do that again just to make sure that I got it right. All right, so let's look at number 1 and 2. And that'll be a good place to start. We'll do these two questions. And they talk about this timeline up here, which is titled Important Events in Early Cherokee History. So again, not questions directly related to what we talked about, but in kind of the same sphere. And again, that's really all you can do to prepare for the test, is just kind of give yourself a base of knowledge that's widely applicable. So the timeline here starts in about 800 and then works up to 1838. So obviously this first chunk is significantly earlier than kind of the stuff we were talking about today. But the end of the timeline is essentially where we were discussing Native Americans today. So we've got 1800, Cherokee adopt agriculture with corn as a major crop. In 1540, Europeans first visit Cherokee villages, spreading deadly disease such as smallpox. So that's 1540. Their kind of first encounter with Europeans. 1700, white settlers begin to clash with Cherokee over possession of land in the South. Okay, so keep in mind, we talked about the Trail of Tears, which was in the 1830s, but there was 130 years of conflict where this was building and building and building to where it got so bad that they forced them to leave, right? So 1700 is kind of when that started. 1800, Cherokee adopt white farming methods, religion, and lifestyle. So a lot of Cherokee essentially became culturalized, if that's a word. I don't think it is, right? But there is a word that I'm looking for, but I can't remember it. But essentially, they adopt the European way of life. So the way the Europeans were farming, their religions, and the way they dressed and interacted with people on a daily basis. 1820, the Cherokee developed a written language that is still used to this day. So prior to that, they didn't have a need for a written language. They had a spoken language, and they interacted. They didn't have a written language. Okay? And in 1838, Cherokee they were forced to give up their lands in the South and move and relocate to Oklahoma. So, with that said, let's actually answer these questions. Number 1 says, which of the following is a conclusion based on multiple details in the timeline? So, conclusion based on details. So remember, conclusion is something not specifically mentioned. It's something that, after looking at everything, something that we can say is likely or is probably true. It's not necessarily a declarative statement. It's saying, based on this information, we can assume this is true. Right? A, the Cherokee had begun farming around 800 before Europeans came to America. Okay? Not a conclusion. Definitely a detail, right? We can look here and it's specifically mentioned, right? That's just a detail. B, although the Cherokee adopted many aspects of white culture, they were driven off their ancestral lands. Okay. I've never done this question, so I don't know the answer to it just off the top of my head. But that sounds possible. That could be the right answer, but let's look at C and D. C, the Cherokee traditionally considered land ownership a tribal matter rather than a right of individuals acting on their own. Or D, the Bible was one of the first books the Cherokee translated into their written language. Okay, so I'm not sure about C, but I definitely feel like D is one we can throw away, right? And just for the fact that we know only one thing about the written language. We know it was developed in 1820 or around there, right? But there's nothing in this timeline that tells us the Bible was one of the first books written about it, right? So we can't assume, right? So if we look at B and we look at C, and I'm just looking down in my book here to make sure I don't give us any false advertising. Okay, so let's read B and C a little bit closer. B says, although the Cherokee adopted many aspects of white culture, they were driven off their ancestral lands. C says the Cherokee traditionally considered land ownership to be a tribal matter rather than a right of individuals acting on their own. This is a tough one, or I think it seems like it could be confusing, right? But C, although it sounds like something that could be true, there is nothing on this timeline that lets us believe that this is something that we know, right? There isn't anything on there that definitively makes this make any sense or makes it verifiably true. Whereas B seems like the most likely option, right? Because it says, although the Cherokee adopted many aspects of white culture, and we know that they did adopt many aspects of white culture according to the timeline, right? Just according to this. They give us this information here. Cherokee adopt white farming methods, religion, and lifestyle in 1800. So we know that happened. Although that was the case, they were driven off of their ancestral lands or where they lived. And again, we can assume that their ancestral lands were where they were originally located. And so B is the best choice here. I don't necessarily like these options as much. I mean, I think that there would be a more clear and concise way to this question, and definitely their answer choices I think are iffy. But again, I don't like the GED test, so you have to kind of sort through questions that sometimes are either unclear or ambiguous or just not constructed right. And it's not ideal, but you still have to get the question right, and you still get penalized if you get it wrong, right? So do the best you can. So lastly, and we're just out of time, so let's do number 2 real quick and then we'll stop. When President Andrew Jackson mandated that the Cherokee move west in 1830, he claimed that the U.S. government would be better able to protect the Cherokee from whites who might try to get their new land in the west. Cherokee considered this to be illogical. Which of the following summarizes the logical fallacy? Okay, so logical fallacy is kind of a crazy vocab word, right? But it's essentially saying that the President of the United States tried to convince the Native Americans that if they were to move and live in this new place in the West, they would be safer from whites there than if they stayed in their homeland. The Indians didn't understand that and didn't think it made sense. So even though the question asks us which of the following summarizes the logical fallacy, which is a confusing way of just saying what I just said. Why did the Indians not think that made sense? That's all they're asking. A, if the government can't protect us from white settlers here, now, how could it protect us from whites moving west in the future? That to me sounds like a good answer. But let's just run through the others real quick and make sure. B, if you ask us to move to the west now, how do we know you won't ask us to move back to the south in the future? C, if the land we have in the south is good, why wouldn't the land in the west be better? And D, if the state governments are protecting us now, why can't the U.S. government help later? Okay. Again, what directly relates to the question and what seems like the best answer for lack of time, right, is A, right? And the book says, and let's see if this explanation is better than mine. It says this question shows the lack of logic in the government's claim that location was what made it difficult to protect Cherokee rights. Location had nothing to do with the government's lack of protecting the Cherokee in the South. The government did not have the political will to enforce laws protecting the Cherokee. So again, the Indians thought, well, if you're telling us to move west and you're going to protect us there, why can't you just let us stay where we are and you protect us here, right? That's what the Indians. So it didn't make any sense, and that's why. And they had pretty good foresight. It didn't make any sense, and they weren't able to protect them in the west, as we know now. Okay, so let's stop there for the day if we don't have any more questions, and we will pick up tomorrow with the Civil War and talk about the Civil War and do our best to kind of sum that up in half an hour. Okay? All right, hopefully that was helpful. I will see you back tomorrow, same time, same place. Social studies. Hope everybody has a good day. All right, thank you guys.